As Michael just said, we're going to close today's forum on a truly special note with U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. Under Secretary Duncan's leadership, the Department of Education has worked to increase college graduation rates and expect by the end of this decade to have the highest rate in the history of our country. And in that context, have secured increases in Pell Grants and launched an income-based student loan repayment program. As you well know, Secretary Duncan has put in place and moved forward a reform effort, race to the top, and also investing in education. Secretary Duncan has also led the department in investing substantially in low-performance schools throughout the country, a subject that we have discussed today. Secretary Duncan has been immersed in public education throughout his career. He was the chief executive officer of the Chicago public school system, and with enormous success united the education community, not always an easy thing, behind school reform in Chicago. Following his remarks, Secretary Duncan will take questions from the floor. And with that, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome to the podium United States Secretary of the, almost said Secretary of the Treasury, United States Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. You definitely don't want me at the Treasury, so quite happy where I am. I'm going to keep my remarks pretty brief. Love to have a conversation with you. I'm just thrilled this audience and this community is focused on education. And obviously, we think there's just nothing more important for the country to be engaged in. Lots of challenges, lots of hard work ahead of us, but I really do believe collectively we have a chance to break through in a fundamental way. So I thought I'd give you a little snapshot of where I think we are, where we're trying to go, and what the next steps are. A couple numbers haunt me, keep me up every single night. 25% dropout rate in this country. That's 1 million of our kids leaving our schools for our streets each year. No good jobs out there for them. In many of our African and Latino communities, that's 40, 50, 60%. And we're devastating not just children and families, but entire communities unless we fundamentally challenge that. Many of you guys know these stats. We used to lead the world in college graduation rates. Today we're 14th. 13 other countries have passed us by, and then we wonder why we're struggling economically. And then I continue to think about what I call the skills gap. In a time of high unemployment rates, we have as many as 2 million high-wage, high-skilled jobs that we can't fill. I think we in education have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what are we doing to close that gap? So those are the challenges. What are the implications? Again, your reports have been so important on this. The economic imperative to get better. People have talked about the dropout rate as having the effect of a permanent recession on our economy. You guys know the employment rates for college graduates versus high school graduates versus high school dropouts. The dividing line in our country is absolutely staggering there. So economic imperative, issue of national security, which I think more and more people are becoming aware of, and kind of Lisa Rice has been so passionate and clear on this that it's a little staggering. 75% of our nation's young people can't qualify for military service. They're academically unprepared, physically unfit, or have a criminal record. That's simply not good enough. And I've said repeatedly, I was in Topeka, Kansas as part of our 2-week back to school bus tour with Dennis Van Roykel. Went to Topeka, Kansas, site of Brown versus Board. And I said there, I've said for years, I think this is the civil rights issue of our generation. And I'm just convinced the dividing line in our country today is much more not race, not class, but around educational opportunity. And if we're serious about closing achievement gaps, we have to close opportunity gaps. And I don't think we have had anything near the sense of urgency and commitment to closing those opportunity gaps that we need to as a country. And to be at the side of Brown versus Board, obviously more than 5 decades ago, and to look at the staggering inequities, inequalities, and opportunities today by any measure, we have to get better faster. So all of those things compel us to act. The President has provided just extraordinary leadership on this. He understands what's at stake. Congress, despite the current dysfunction in the past, has been supportive. And we all have to work on this together, put politics and ideology to the side. Together, we have to educate our way to a better economy and get our country in a much different place. How do we get there? I always talk about a cradle-to-career agenda. We have to start with early childhood education. I think I can make a pretty compelling case that's the best investment we can make. If we can get our babies, our 3- and 4-year-olds, into kindergarten at 5, ready to read, ready to succeed, we start to close those achievement gaps, we close the opportunity gap. If we don't do that, we are constantly playing catch up. We play catch up at every level of the education system, from primary to middle to high school. Many of our colleges today, 30, 40, 50% of young people are taking remedial classes in college. They're simply not ready. So that investment in early childhood education is so important. I've been very public saying historically, in many ways, I think our Department of Education has been part of the problem. This is one of those areas where we simply didn't invest in early childhood education. With Congress's support over the past 2 years, over $600 million to going to states that are willing to increase access, make sure it's high quality, and going into disadvantaged communities. This is a long-term play. We're not going to see the results today or tomorrow or next week or next year, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, I think the implications there are huge. On K-12 reform, obviously that's the next step. Thanks to the Recovery Act, we were able to save about 400,000 jobs of teachers and educators. And while still as a country we lost about 300,000, I really do believe we staved off an education catastrophe. And it would have been just stunning to see what would have happened to class size, what would have happened to extracurriculars, what would have happened to more schools going to 4-day weeks rather than 5-day weeks, going the wrong direction, had we allowed those 400,000 teachers to leave our schools and go onto the unemployment lines. So I thought it was a very important move at the time. Would love to have been able to do more, couldn't do more than that. But again, I think it staved off, it would have been an absolute disaster. We've seen 46 states voluntarily raise standards, college and career-ready standards that are internationally benchmarked. That is an absolute game changer. And I think I keep trying to get someone to challenge me on this. I literally think this is the first time in our nation's history that a child in Mississippi and a child in Massachusetts is going to be held to the same yardstick. And teaching to those higher standards is going to take a lot of effort. We've got to be much more thoughtful in professional development, getting parents to understand this, thinking about how students understand the work level that's going to be required of them. There's a massive implementation and communications challenge that states are working through in a very significant way. But we know over the past 5, 10 years, many states dummied down standards, went the opposite direction because it made politicians look good. It's bad for children, bad for education, bad for the country. The politicians of both parties had some political benefit for saying their results were better. And to see states moving the opposite direction is a big, big, big deal. One quick example, Tennessee, my numbers won't be exact, but in Tennessee, before they raised standards, they were saying, I think it was like 4th grade math, that 91% of students were proficient. When they raised standards, it went from something like 91% to 38%. And achievement gaps that were already large doubled. Achievement gaps doubled. But guess what? For the first time, they were telling the truth. They were setting an honest baseline, and we can all work together from that point. So implementation is the big, big challenge moving forward, but I couldn't be more proud of the leadership of political leaders, state superintendents, folks across the country doing the right thing together in raising standards. I mentioned as I was coming in, chronically low-performing schools. Race to the top has gotten all the press. That's fine. That was $4 billion for the country. What folks haven't focused on, I think, enough is we also invested $4 billion in the bottom 5% of schools, a massively disproportionate investment, not in the status quo, but in a very different vision of reform. We have 1,300 schools now across the country, elementary, middle, high school, urban, rural, suburban, that are in the process of being turned around. It's very, very early in the first year or two, but in many of those schools, we're seeing double-digit gains in reading scores, double-digit gains in math scores, graduation rates up significantly. High school we were at, talking to the principal in Topeka, in 1 year, they've had a 90% reduction in violent incidents and discipline problems at the school. Starting to be a climate which you can talk about AP calculus and physics and going on to college. A massive amount of change. Folks at the local level, management, superintendents, union leaders are working and collaborating in really, really tough work with almost no drama. And the fact that people aren't yelling and screaming at each other, then the press doesn't pay any attention. But I think this has been just an unbelievable profile and courage. The NEA, under Dennis Van Roykel's leadership, is helping to turn around these schools. He and I visited a school in Prince George's County where they had moved out a significant portion of the staff, had brought in more social workers, more counselors. Very public meeting like this, the head of the union, Lewis Robinson, stood up, said, "This is the hardest thing I've probably ever done in my career, but I had to do it. The kids deserve better." And we can go through all the data, but as I visited dozens of these schools around the country, to hear the students talking about what's different for them today is extraordinarily powerful. One young man recently told me, he was a senior going on to graduate, said, "This has been fantastic. I wish you guys would have done it a lot sooner. I would have had a lot more of my friends with me instead of on the streets. And so we have to continue to push very, very hard in this area. The final thing on the K-12 side has been the waivers, the flexibility we're provided around No Child Left Behind. And this has just been absolutely fascinating to me. It's been a joy to work on. This was Plan B. We wanted Congress to fix the law and fix it in a bipartisan way. The law has been broken in many different ways, and we can get into that in Q&A, and people might have differences of opinion, but I think the law was actually impeding progress and impeding innovation and stifling creativity. We've approved waivers to 32, 33 states. We have another dozen that we're working through the process now. And to see these states just in so many ways showing great courage, moving away from just a focus on one test score, but looking at growth and gain, how much a student's improving, and looking at a whole set of other metrics. Our graduation rates going up, our dropout rates going down, are more of our high school graduates actually college and career ready, not having to take remedial classes? Are they actually going to college? Are they persevering? Some folks are arguing this is more complicated. It is absolutely more complex, but it's much more holistic, much more comprehensive. I always say if you have great third grade test scores but a 50% dropout rate, you're not changing students' lives. Looking at long-term outcomes, I think, is a huge step in the right direction. What also came out through this process is under No Child Left Behind. This gets a little technical because in many schools, end size was pretty high. Many children, poor children, minority children, children with special needs, English language learners, literally weren't part of the accountability system. Literally weren't, they were invisible under that. And we have states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, where 15,000, 20,000 additional children are now, the states are going to be held accountable for their results. That's a huge step in the right direction. So the benefits have been fantastic here. Ultimately, we desperately hope Congress will reauthorize and reauthorize in a bipartisan way, and the President and I stand ready to spend as much time as we need to help them get there. The best thing that can happen once we get to that point, again, whether it's now or next month or next year, whenever it might be, is that we don't design this law here in Washington, but we take the best ideas from the best states. And if you do that, you could have a pretty spectacular reauthorization. If we put our heads in the sand here in Washington, I think we do a disservice to the leadership that's going on around the country. Finally, all of this is to what end? It's trying to increase access and completion rates in college. We've made a huge play around community colleges. We think they're this unrecognized gem along the education continuum, put unprecedented resources behind community colleges that are partnering directly with the private sector, where public-private partnerships, real training are leading to real jobs. Some of my most inspiring visits around the country are to community colleges and see 18-year-olds and 38-year-olds and 58-year-olds retraining and retooling and green energy jobs and advanced manufacturing and healthcare and IT. It's amazing what community colleges are doing to drive economic revitalization, not just in their communities, but in entire regions. And so we want to continue to invest very, very heavily there, not just from our department, but in partnership with the Department of Labor as well. One of the things I'm most proud of is we've increased from about 6 million Pell recipients to 10 million Pell recipients over the past 2 years. It's more than a 50% increase. Many of these young people are first-generation college goers. $40 billion increase in Pell Grants over the next decade. We did that without going back to taxpayers for a nickel. Simply stopped subsidizing banks. Hope I don't offend anybody here. Put all that money into young people. We thought that was the right investment to make. That was wildly controversial here in Washington. We thought it made absolute common sense. We moved the ball down the field a heck of a long way through that effort. And then finally, on the higher ed side, we're promoting a big agenda around transparency. And when costs are so high, everyone has to step up. Universities have to keep costs down. States have to continue to invest. 40 states cut funding to higher ed last year. That's not something that's good for us. But trying to give young people and their families the ability to just basic information. What's a grant? What's a loan? If I'm looking at these 3 different universities, what's the better financial aid package for us? There's been a tremendous opaqueness around that. If we can increase transparency, we think good actors will get more customers, more students going their way. Bad actors where costs are too high, graduation rates are too low, we'll see less folks come their way, and hopefully some market pressure will come to bear there. So we have to continue to work extraordinarily hard. This is not simply about education. We are not going to have a strong country and a strong economy if we don't strengthen what we're doing at every level, early childhood, K-12, higher ed. Those 2 things are inextricably linked. As we move forward, we want to stay very, very focused on where we're going. Continue to focus on the early childhood investment. We're in that for the long haul. The K-12 side, continue to drive reform. Think about how, I know you're talking about technology, how can technology increase efficiency, better outcomes as well. Think about the next generation of teachers coming in. And we've talked a lot about this RESPECT initiative, which I'm happy to get into, with 1 million teachers retiring over the next 4, 5, 6 years. Our ability to attract and retain great talent now shapes public education for the next 30. There's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And how do we make a real profession where great talent wants to come, great talent wants to stay, gets recognized, gets compensated, gets rewarded, has the career ladders that are meaningful to them. A lot of work we can do together to make it a profession where we're not losing far too many of our great young talent and losing far too many folks at the front end who won't even think about coming into education. So we're going to push very, very hard there. And then the higher education side, we have to fundamentally break through on the cost issue. And with, again, 40 states cutting funding, more and more middle-class families are thinking college isn't for them. Told the story, I was in Iowa not too long ago at a forum like this. A young girl came up to me, she was a senior in high school. She said right then, she happened to have a twin brother, right then at her family at the dinner time, they're trying to decide which twin to send to college, she or her brother. That's just real. This is not a desperately poor area. No family should have to be in that situation. So how do we get universities to keep tuition down? How do we get universities to build cultures not around just access but completion? How do we get 40 states to invest more in higher education, not less? I keep asking the question of governors, if 80% of you cut funding to higher education, how many of you cut funding for prisons, for corrections? And the room always gets real quiet when I ask that question. So how do we collectively, we want to invest in Pell Grants and other things. We can't do it by ourselves. This idea of shared responsibility, how do we step up to the plate? Ultimately, how do I want to be held accountable? The president has drawn a line in the sand. He said by 2020, we have to lead the world in college graduation rates. So that's the North Star. Are we graduating young people from high school, college, and career ready? And ultimately, if we have the best educated workforce in the world, we're going to have a very strong country and a very strong economy. If we continue to be 14th, 15th, 16th, we're going to continue to struggle for a long time. I think that's absolutely unacceptable to all of us. But I'll stop there, take any questions you might have, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. You got a mic coming.
Diane Silber, clinical psychologist. I would like you to flesh out a little more how you're going to bring in a new generation of teachers with more respect and higher status in our society.
Yeah, so we're still working it through, and actually this is a conversation we're trying to help facilitate, but we really think teachers should be leading this. And we have held literally hundreds of town hall meetings with teachers around the country, thousands of teachers led by our teacher ambassador fellows. But what I fundamentally think is this entire pipeline is broken. So this is not an easy fix. We don't have the right talent pool coming in. If you look at high-performing countries, Finland, Singapore, others, 100% of their teachers come from the top third or even the top 10% of their college graduates. We're all the way at the other end. How we train teachers is woefully inadequate right now. 62% of young teachers tell us that they're unprepared to enter the classroom. I always say if 62% of doctors said they were unprepared to practice medicine, we would have a revolution in this country. But the fact that as teachers, somehow that's okay. I've been very public saying we should pay teachers a lot more money. We need to have meaningful career ladders so that master teachers, mentor teachers can stay in the profession for the long term. So this is, for me, what do we do differently from 18-year-olds all the way up to 58, 65-year-olds? Not an easy fix, but we have to challenge the status quo at every single level. We want to help facilitate this, but you have great teachers around the country who are starting to demand this. I think it's so important that we empower them and listen to them. We're calling this the Respect Project. The president has asked $5 billion from Congress to put behind this. We have lots of information on our website. This is still evolving as we think it through, but this is one where the public, unions, management, parents, I think all of us have mutual self-interest in getting the next generation of great talent in and doing a much better job of retaining them.
Mr. Secretary, the administration under your leadership, your commendable leadership, did a series of pioneering things during this first term, and you referred to some of them: Race to the Top, investment in underperforming schools, student loan reforms, and the like. If there is a second term, can you give us a sense
when there is a second term?
When there's a second term, can you give us a sense of what the agenda might be in that second term,
yes,
in the same context of the types of pioneering steps you've so far taken?
Yeah, so we're still obviously fleshing that through, but I think the big thing I tried to allude to earlier is I really want us to stay focused, and for me this is not a time for us to make left turns. So I think continuing to invest in early childhood education is hugely important. thinking about how you drive reform on the K-12 side, getting much better, getting graduation rates, reductions in dropout rates, talked about the next generation of talent, thinking about how technology can play both there and in higher ed. And then ultimately we have to crack the nut on the higher ed side of having many more, not just disadvantaged young people, but middle-class families think that college is for them, and that it can't just go. We have to increase completion rates. So how we get there, we need to think all that thing through. We had, at the start of the administration, $100 billion in Recovery Act money. I would love to have $100 billion again. That's probably not realistic. And so how we think about carrots in different ways, I'm a much bigger believer in carrots than sticks. The waiver process has been fascinating to me, that would provide this huge amount of flexibility and room to be creative. And we haven't done it perfectly, and there's some lessons learned, but we did all that with no money, not a nickel out there. We provide a little bit more flexibility to states in how they use existing resources. But so how do we be creative with our rules, with our regulations? How do we become a much better partner to states and less top-down bureaucracy, much more focused on innovation and taking to scale best practices? There are areas, the Invest in Innovation Fund, the Promised Neighborhood stuff we haven't talked about. If we had more financial resources, I would love to invest a lot more. There's so many good ideas out there that we haven't been able to get to. But I don't see us changing directions radically in any way whatsoever. How do we stay the course? How do we stay focused? And how do we continue to get results? One quick is on the turnaround stuff, turnaround schools, the school improvement grants. Talked a little bit about the data. One thing I'm really proud of is we have 700,000 less kids today going to quote-unquote dropout factories than a couple years ago. So that's a huge step in the right direction, but we still have so many kids going to dropout factories. So how do we get that number to zero as quick as we can? That's what I think we need to hold ourselves accountable for. How are we implementing, how are we executing against it? The last thing I'll say is that the Common Core implementation is a big, big, big deal. And raising standards is great, it's the easy part. The hard part is getting everyone to work to those standards. How we all help real teachers in real classrooms with real students teach to these higher standards is going to take a lot of collective work. I'm sorry.
Hi, Secretary Duncan. My name is Matthew Shibley. I'm originally a Chicago Public School graduate at Whitney Young High School.
Pretty good school.
Thank you. And as you know, CPS has a pretty high dropout rate, almost 50%. Only 4% of people actually end up getting their bachelor's degree. And I wanted to know, we've been talking today about charter schools and failing schools, public schools, really good public schools. How would you recommend prioritizing limited funding? Do you support a school that's doing well, that's succeeding? How does that leave money for failing schools and then charter schools in this time of less financial resources?
Yeah, there's so many debates in education that I just think, quite honestly, are false debates and sort of absolutely miss the point. And just, I'll answer it in a second, but there's always this debate, college versus careers. I think it's a crazy debate. We need so many more students prepared to go to college. We need so many more students prepared to go for careers. We're not doing a good enough job on either one of those, so it's not either or, it's both and. And in fact, when you really look at it, the skill set needed for college and careers is actually very similar, so we waste a lot of time there. Charter schools, traditional schools, gifted schools, magnet schools, we just need more good public schools in this country. That's what we need. And I always say, you ask any 7-year-old, do I go to a charter school or a gifted or a traditional? They don't have any idea. Do I have a great teacher? Am I in a safe school? Does the principal know how I am? We need a lot more schools that look like that. So high-performing charter schools, we need to replicate them. We need to help them grow. We need to learn from them. There's been so much tension between charters and districts. We've got to share better. One thing I tried to start to do at the end of Chicago, I think the charter school community has actually been much better at replicating success. We're trying to get districts to start to replicate success. So we started replicating the high-performing district schools, mostly elementary, but we spun off some college preps, as you know, more like Whitney Young. And so the more good schools are expanding, replicating, we know where we have waiting lists, and the more we don't tolerate failure. And we have extraordinarily high-performing charter schools. When I talk about the 5,000 lowest performing schools in the country, I think 200 of those are charters. And I've challenged the charter school community. There's nothing about the name charter that means quality. Quality means quality, and the charter school community has to challenge themselves to close down or phase out those schools that aren't working. So success, let's replicate of every form and fashion. Non-success, failure, let's have a much lower level of tolerance for it. Our tolerance for failure has been far too high for far too long. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Secretary, I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm a John Dewey educated person. He was my mother's mentor, and she typed her way through graduate school, typing all of his books. So I'm just giving you kind of where I'm coming from.
A little history there.
Yeah. I'm a great believer in collaborative learning. In the complex world we live in today, just thinking if you're this good in math but don't understand anything else, I think we're all losing out on that. And one of the things I've observed in a lot of these public schools is the job is to give the answer, not to ask the right question.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, how do we open up curiosity and allow these kids to challenge and not be penalized because their teachers don't understand the answers? I mean, their job is really to say, well, who has the answer and where do we go find it? But I see things, I've been with the Defense Department for 35 years. Everything's siloed. Getting them to talk horizontally is really hard. And I'm hoping you will do something about that in our educational system, starting with kindergarten.
So we're working on it. We're not there yet. A lot there. Couple things. Ultimately, the question is sort of what do we value? What skills are we trying to teach? And is it the rote memorization of facts that maybe you and I did some of, and now you can Google anything? You need less ability to have all that stuff memorized. Penmanship, handwriting. How big a deal is that going forward? But your basic point of collaboration, critical thinking skills, being able to work as part of a diverse team. As I go out and talk to CEOs around the country, every different type of sector, that's what they're looking for. And again, you have amazing schools, traditional schools, charter schools, high schools, elementary, literally kindergarten, where you see remarkable work going on, where teachers aren't fostering that curiosity and asking questions the whole time and teaching across the curriculum in very different ways. It is clearly not the norm. It is clearly more the exception. I always get asked, what's the appropriate federal role? I think about that every day. What's our role? What's the state role? What's the local role? One of the best uses of federal time and energy and resources, I think, is for us to shine a spotlight on best practices to help to scale them with more resources, with more flexibility, whatever it might be. So where we're seeing those skill sets being taught, putting more resources, giving them more flexibility, shining a spotlight, convening groups of teachers and principals to talk about those things, we think are really, really important. So we can help to try and build that culture. Long way to go. The other thing that's emerging that I'm really interested in that's related but not identical is we talk a lot about the cognitive versus non-cognitive skills. There's a lot of work now around grit and resiliency and perseverance. I spent my whole life working in the inner city in the south side of Chicago in a very impoverished community, and everyone came from a very tough spot. Those kids that went out, made it out and did extraordinarily well, had this resiliency and grit that is just mind-blowing. And so how do we start to teach those kinds of things, those skills? A little thing I try to do just, at home, I have 2 young kids at home, trying to ask them at night sometimes, what did you fail at today? Sort of a non-traditional question. Not what did you succeed at, what did you fail at? What did you have to challenge yourself? What did you not get right? How was that? And so I think we're just a very different world in terms of the skill sets that our young people, they have to be lifelong learners, and how we train teachers differently in the front end, how we get more employers building real partnerships with high schools and middle schools and elementary schools and articulating this. It's really important. Last thing, I don't want to go on too long, won't say which state, I went to a state where I met with about a dozen superintendents in a room and about a dozen CEOs. And this is sort of more blue-collar manufacturing, that kind of work. Had a conversation, asked the CEOs, how many of these high school graduates are ready to come to work for you? They said 50%. The room got real quiet. I said, how often do you guys talk together? They said, when the secretary comes to town. They had never met. They had never met. So these are great educators, great business leaders. They're all in the same community. They're all invested. They're not going anywhere. We have to break those barriers. And the more those, we can help facilitate, but the more at the local level those conversations are happening as well, we need that. We need business and education both to get out of their silos. I'm getting the hook.
No. Secretary Duncan, I don't know where you will fail today, but I know one place you've succeeded, which is in these remarks and your comments. You were terrific. Let's give the Secretary a big hand. Thank you. You were great. You really were.